When I was younger and in middle school, I didn't have a lot of friends. The greatest appeal of the weekend resided more or less in the ability to stay up late and watch Cartoon Network. At the time, Cartoon Network launched these titles they unimaginatively named cartoons. I'm sure you've heard of them. Things like Johnny Bravo, Dexter's Laboratory, and Cow and Chicken. At the time, these titles were spin-offs of shorts they periodically aired under the guise The What a Cartoon Show, a kind of animation variety show. They would air new episodes every Friday night. I personally didn't think too much of them, but it was something to watch anyway. Lying in my bed those nights and relaxing after a week of school, knowing I could sleep in the next morning, was easily the most comfortable memory for me. I still fondly recall those times with a warm sense of nostalgia, back when TV made sense to me. After all these shows were done being aired, they'd put on random programs that were as bland as they came. Something like the Flintstones, I don't remember. After that though, they'd put on my favourite show. It came on towards midnight to 1 in the morning. It was called Space Ghost Coast to Coast. That show at the time seemed like it was the best thing ever. As much as I enjoyed these newer cartoons, I always felt the need for something less mild and child-oriented, and more scaled towards adults. It's hard to explain, but I loved these cartoons and wish they made something darker, more mature, swearing and such. I was only 14, and the internet wasn't as integral as it is today. So obviously I couldn't YouTube search something like salad fingers or the such. So I had to take these things whenever and wherever I could find them. That show was among these. Dark, random, totally insane, and most importantly, targeted towards mature audiences. This was all pre-Adult Swim era, which would someday prove to be the holy grail I've been waiting for. Before that though, there was just this. When it was over, they just aired reruns of the Flintstones or whatever. I'd continue to watch the channel until I'd fall asleep. At some point in time though, there would be a show that came on after Space Ghost. For the life of me, I couldn't remember what it was called. I've searched the web based on its general description, but there's nothing to be found. From what I could remember, there was a show that was more or less a collage of animated shorts that I think were submitted by various animation students from around the world. I think it was a Canadian-based show that was adapted for America. For the sake of reference, think back to the 90s when MTV hosted a random chunk of airtime for cartoons. There was this one bit that I found particularly hilarious. It was an animated short implementing a mock documentary about an endangered species of purple monsters. You'll have to excuse my lack of accuracy in this description, as my memory's hazy. It's been well over 10 years since I've watched this. The documentary discloses the process of how the monsters live their lives in peace and harmony with the land, and how their existence is a miracle of nature. But then it takes a dark turn when the monsters reveal to be a valuable prize, and they show them getting killed off by hunters. Or so I think. At the end of the fake documentary, they pan it out to reveal that it was on a TV, and that we see an old couple are watching it. After the value of the animal is revealed to the old man, he picks up a gun and leaves the room. You hear a gunshot, and then he comes back in with a look of satisfaction. I think it was implied that they had one as a pet, and cold-heartedly murdered it for the profit's sake. Either way, to me it was hilariously executed, as the humour was extremely dark and dry. It was those kind of shorts that kept drawing me to this short-lived TV show. Sometimes the shorts were horrible, sometimes they made absolutely no sense. Occasionally they were pretentious and overly artistic. and whatever the implied message was that was being expressed sailed directly over my head. And yet I watched it anyway, because I was friendless and weird and had nothing better to do. So one Friday night, my parents went out to get drunk at a bar or whatever, and I had the house to myself. In celebration of my unsupervised freedom on this one particular Friday night, I did as I would do any other weekend night. I flipped to channel 67 and watched cartoons. Everything was normal up until when that show came on. The opening montage played as normal, showing several clips from several different submittals featured on the show, with some random song playing over or whatever. Then there was the title for the show, and then it faded to black and proceeded with the first short. Now, sometimes at the beginning of these shorts, they preceded the episode with a still image containing the title. Other times it just goes straight into it. This time around, though, it was difficult to see which opening style they were going for. The screen just stayed dark, black, with no content to be witnessed whatsoever. It was pure silence, and it stayed silent for a long time. At first I thought that maybe my TV wasn't hooked up right, or that a wire in the back of the cable box fell out. Then I thought that maybe this was some variation of an emergency broadcasting station. They do that from time to time, yet not like this. It was intriguing at first, because I thought they were trying something different. And as I said, I was eager for something different, something more serious and adult-like. But no, this was just a blank channel, nothing more. I started getting impatient. I decided that enough was enough, and reached for the remote to change the channel to something else to make sure the cable box was working. And that's when the weirdness began to take place. You know when you record something with a microphone, and in that pause between sounds, you can hear a hissing sound. Some people call it fuzz, white noise, whatever. Anyway, this noise began to fade in like a song, quiet at first. I could barely hear it when I first noticed, but it was just loud enough to catch my attention. I lowered the remote and looked at the screen. The blankness of the program began to show grainy imagery, static in the corners, as if what I was watching was of a bootleg quality video played off of an old VHS. The noise was getting louder and louder until it went from a slight hiss to something like rushing water. It didn't transcend the volume level of my TV, but I could absolutely tell it was loud. On the end of the recorders, this output was clearly maxed out. The static or tracking of the video quality made it clearly known that something was definitely playing, even though there was still only blankness behind the light static. Then I saw the words, or at least an out-of-focus resemblance of them. I couldn't read them, not at first. I was more and more intrigued by this odd exhibition. I found myself moving closer to the screen, squinting my eyes to try and make the words out. I got close enough to see my own reflection in the TV screen, and still, the words were hard to read. But I could tell that they were slowly coming into focus, very slowly. I could make out the letter L and an N, and before long I could see that the words read, "For Linda." The moment I realised what I was reading, a sound snapped into the video, making me jump and shout out a word my parents would undoubtedly ground me for saying. It was creaking. At first, I thought it was just a sound from in my own house. Those sounds you hear late at night in an old house, like the creaking floorboards or the pipes expanding behind the walls. But it didn't take me long to realise it was actually coming from the program. The quality of it was loud and it was severely clipping. For those of you who don't know what clipping is, just imagine us screaming into a hypersensitive microphone and playing it back. You don't hear clarity, you just hear muffled distortion and chaos. That's what this creaking was like. The sound proceeded in 4-second intervals and was emitting rhythmically over and over again. Gawking at the TV like a staring fool, I reached over and adjusted the volume button. It was still at 30%, but the volume on the TV seemed so much louder. As I was bringing it down to 25%, the words on the poorly tracked screen that said "For Linda" suddenly disappeared, along with the static-like quality in general, and a commercial for home equity loans popped up and scared the hell out of me. In a way, I was quite relieved. This to me felt like I was coming up for air after being dunked underwater by something terrible. I had no idea what the hell was happening with this channel, but I couldn't in good conscience change it. This was breaking the pattern, what was otherwise the monotony of my childhood. So I sat through these commercials, laughing uneasily at the irony of actually enjoying them for once. It didn't even bother me that Cartoon Network had a tendency to advertise responsible adult content on what is otherwise a channel whose audience were primarily children. The last commercial was that black and white Jim Sokolov commercial. Something about getting paid for getting hurt working, but it doesn't matter. When it ended, the screen turned black again. That VHS quality popped back into view and was immediately preceded by the blown-out hissing and rhythmic creaking noise. But there was actual animation to be seen this time around. It was fading in from the black. The image was an animated shot of a crudely designed old man sitting in a rocking chair in a windowless black room, rocking back and forth. The room was dark and appeared to be lit by a horrible-looking candle, whose flame consisted of 2 frames on loop. The view was from the side, and he was mildly rocking back and forth with his hands folded over his lap. I could see that his eyes were closed. This made me feel uneasy. Was he resting his eyes, or was he actually asleep? Every aspect of him looked less like a carefully designed cartoon character, and more like a paper doll filmed in a stop-motion fashion, and a very poorly executed style at that. His movements were jumpy, so much so that it reminded me of an old PS1 game where the characters would glitch uncontrollably. It was very distracting and annoying at first. What made this so creepy to me wasn't the jumpy animation, or that crudely real-looking paper doll approach, or even that bizarre use of audio quality. No. The creepiest part were the textures of what they used to comprise the old man and the scenery. You see, your standard animation model of a character consists of black outlines and a colour for its fill. It varies from cartoon to cartoon, but sometimes you'll also notice a variation of shading approaching on the face and clothing. None of this even remotely applied to the old man on the chair. His skin appeared to be textured, not with a basic colour, but a real detailed variation of skin. I know it sounds weird to hear, but it seemed like he was thrown together with photographs of random real-life textures that were cut into shapes to make up everything we saw in the cartoon. If you're familiar with how South Park was first made, I'm sure you'll understand what I mean. It's not an uncommon technique, and it's actually suited the variety show well, given the wide array of styles they've used in the past. But something was just wrong about these textures. The skin texture of his face was as real as it came. I could see the pores, the wrinkles, which at first seemed like an awesome aesthetic, except I could also see scars. He was covered in them, and some of them were greenish grey, as if the skin was infected or bruised. Some of them were caked in blood and scabs. The scars were fresh. The texture used to comprise his clothing was a real white greyish flannel texture. Much like the skin textures, this seemed off as well. You could see rips and tears in them, dark spots of blood. Across his chest, there was a larger rip in the clothing, and you could see skin underneath. And across the skin was a large cut. It almost looked like an axe wound or a knife slash. Even though it was still, there seemed to be a lot of blood oozing out of it. I even saw that the texture, when captured with the camera, caught a single fly in the shot. The texture of the walls were black asphalt. The candle was that of real fire. 2 separate pictures. The rocking chair consisted of actual wood pictures, several of which were thrown together. You could see how the light's impression on the wood in the cut images varied from image to image, producing an inconsistent pattern of colour shading on the chair that would have been seen as a disgrace to certain artists, and yet it looked oddly impressive for what it was. The old man rocked back and forth, over and over again. Absolutely nothing happened but this. The candle flickered its light with its only 2 fire images, and that was that. I'd say all in all, the cartoon consisted of 24 frames, which is 2 seconds. 2 seconds that played on loop for up to 5 minutes. And I watched every second of it, taking in the imagery, the terrible animation, the loud, obnoxious audio quality, and worst of all, that absurdly gross texture. The next round of commercials interrupted the cartoon without any word of warning. And just like the first time around, it made me jump, but not scream like last time. When the commercials ended, I think I realised what I was watching. The show came right back into it, like there was no commercial breaks and nothing was different, except for 2 things that seemed small at first. Firstly, the old man's head was now turned in the viewer's direction. And secondly, his eyes were open. I didn't notice at first, but when I did, I nearly jumped back again. His eyes were out of proportion with his head, and looked painfully out of place with the rest of him. They were staring, blue, and there was something off about them. I could tell they were real, and not doll's eyes. There were no wrinkles to them. These were the eyes of a younger person, a young girl even. I don't know how I could tell for certain, maybe it was intuition. But I just knew those were cut images of a little girl's eyes. They looked so dead and lifeless, and it felt like they were staring into my soul. It made me feel sick. I remember my stomach feeling like it was lined with mud. Was this a really twisted joke? Were these textures actually made out of what I thought they were made out of? No, Cartoon Network would never allow that. But if this was a spoof or something, I didn't know what. It didn't make sense, because even their twisted humour would have to make their punchlines accessible to their audience, and yet there was nothing accessible about this. But then, it started talking. Or at least, a black rectangle started appearing and disappearing rapidly over its broken lip textures over and over again, to try and make it look like its mouth was opening and closing. I could hear something very faint. A voice. It sounded unintelligible and very far away. I had to raise the volume higher until I could hear it, Under that hissing white noise of the audio, along with the creaking of the chair, which became so loud it started blowing out the speakers on the TV, the voice could be plainly heard. There was something about the quality. Its echo seemed to imply it was being recorded in a large open room, and I could tell it was taking place very far away from the microphone. It was a desperate and despairing voice of a woman, screaming and pleading. It sounded like she was begging someone to stop doing what they were doing. I couldn't make it all out, but for what I could, it seemed fairly simple. She was asking someone not to do it, and saying she was just a child. Those words continued in various orders, over and over again, until the voice broke into a blood-curdling scream, superseded by what sounded like a drill. She started screaming a name. Linda. She was calling out to Linda. The drilling became loud as it began to drill into something. I heard a second voice. A child's voice that transitioned from a scream of pain to uncontrollable crying. 3 seconds later, I heard something that sounded like a fluid being poured onto the ground. My mind painted the scene that matched the audio. I refuse to describe it. All I can say is that it was a perfect audio complement to the animation's textures. The opening and closing of the mouth on that horrible thing in the chair didn't seem to match either of the two voices, as they both consisted of screaming and crying. If this was their attempt at lip syncing, they were doing a horrible job. I didn't think anything of it at first. I just listened to the horror and questioned whether or not it was as real as the textures of the creature itself. But I realized there was a strange blowing sound. It was subtle, but definitely there. I realized that this was a third voice. The worst voice out of them all. I put my ears to the speaker and realized it was whispering. I don't know for a fact, but I think that this whispering was a different audio track because it sounded more clear than everything else. I turned the volume up to its maximum level to be able to hear more clearly what it was saying. It was the whisper of a child. Her words matched the old man's lip syncing perfectly. He rebuilt me in his own image. He rebuilt me in his own image. And on it went, hidden like an Easter egg within the snuff audio. I couldn't tell if this was all one take, or if she said it once and it was just playing on loop. Each time she said it, my spine grew colder. Then, the TV burst into loud, roaring static. I jumped and screamed like a banshee. I punched my TV in a fit of fight or flight response, cracking my knuckle open in the process. There was no logic to it. I slammed my thumb on the lower volume button and watched the volume bars lower and lower until the static was no longer deafening. I backed into my chair and stared at the static, trying to calm myself down and regain my composure. 2 minutes later, the Flintstones opening montage came on. The channel went back to normal, and that was that. Whenever I get really freaked out by something, I always change the channel to Cartoon Network, with the hopes that something simple would come on to comfort me. But after that night, I realized this was a comfort I no longer had access to. I didn't sleep a wink that night. And I couldn't explain this to anyone, because people felt that watching cartoons was considered very uncool among my peers. Eventually, when I became more accustomed to the internet, I started searching high and low for that short. But it was nowhere to be found, and no one ever mentions it in forums. I even looked up the name Linda in news websites regarding any murders. I found a couple of stories, but nothing conclusive. I don't know if this is good or bad though. Good, as in very few people have seen this messed up cartoon short. Or bad, as in the fact that this was insinuating that whoever's responsible is still out there. Providing that what it's implying is real and not some elaborate hoax. I, for one, hope it was a hoax. I hope you enjoyed tonight's terrifying creepypasta. If you're looking for another chilling story, check out this video about a radio DJ who hears strange voices at 3 a.m. See you next time.